of war. If two tribes had a war of extermination, the victorious tribe, by the acquisition of new territory, would be able to increase its numbers. There would also in war be an obvious advantage in an alliance of two or more tribes. If the danger producing the alliance persisted, the alliance would, in time, become an amalgamation. When a unit became too large for all its members to know each other, there would come to be a need of some mechanism for arriving at collective decisions. And this mechanism would inevitably develop by stages into something that a modern man could recognize as government. As soon as there is government, some men have more power than others, and the power that they have depends, broadly speaking, upon the size of the unit that they govern. Love of power will therefore cause the governors to desire conquest. This motive is very much reinforced when the vanquished are made into slaves instead of being exterminated. In this way, at a very early stage, communities arose in which, although primitive impulses towards social cooperation still existed, they were immensely reinforced by the power of the government to punish those who disobeyed it. In the earliest fully historical community, that of ancient Egypt, we find a king whose powers over a large territory were absolute, except for some limitation by the priesthood. And we find a large servile population whom the king could, at his will, employ upon state enterprises, such as the pyramids. In such a community, only a minority at the top of the social scale, the king, the aristocracy, and the priests, needed any psychological mechanism towards social cohesion. All the rest merely obeyed. No doubt large parts of the population were unhappy. One can get a picture of their condition from the first chapters of Exodus. But as a rule, so long as external enemies were not to be feared, this condition of widespread suffering did not prevent the prosperity of the state, and left it unimpaired, and it left unimpaired the enjoyment of life by the holders of power. This state of affairs must have existed for long ages throughout what we now call the Middle East. It depended for its stability upon religion and the divinity of the king. Disobedience was impiety, and rebellion was liable to call down the anger of the gods. So long as the upper social layers genuinely believed this, the rest could be merely disciplined, as we now discipline domestic animals. It is a curious fact that military conquest very often produced in the conquered a genuine loyalty towards their masters. This happened in time with most of the Roman conquests. In the 5th century, when Rome could no longer compel obedience, Gaul remained completely loyal to the empire. All the large states of antiquity owed their existence to military power, but most of them were able, if they lasted long enough, to generate a sense of cohesion in the whole, in spite of the violent resistance of many parts at the time of their incorporation. The same thing happened again with the growth of modern states during the Middle Ages. England, France, and Spain all acquired unity as a result of military victory by a ruler of some part of what became a single nation. In antiquity, all large states except Egypt suffered from a lack of stability, of which the causes were largely technical. When nothing could move faster than a horse, it was difficult for the central government to keep a firm hold upon outlying satraps or proconsuls, who were apt to rebel, sometimes succeeding in conquering the whole empire, and at other times making themselves independent sovereigns of a part of it. Alexander, Attila, and Genghis Khan had vast empires which broke up at their death, and in which unity had depended entirely upon the prestige of a great conqueror. These various empires had no psychological unity, but only the unity of force. Rome did better, because Greco-Roman civilization was something which educated individuals valued, and which was sharply contrasted with the barbarism of tribes beyond the frontier. Until the invention of modern techniques, it was scarcely possible to hold a large empire together unless the upper sections of society, throughout its length and breadth, had some common sentiment by which they were united. And the ways of generating such a common sentiment were much less understood than they are now. The psychological basis of social cohesion, therefore, was still important, although needed only among a governing minority. In ancient communities, the chief advantage of great size, namely the possibility of large armies, was balanced by the disadvantage that it took a long time to move an army from one part of the empire to another, and also that the civil government had not discovered ways of preventing military insurrection. To some degree, these conditions lasted on into modern times. It was largely lack of mobility that caused England, Spain, and Portugal to lose their possessions in the Western Hemisphere. But since the coming of steam and the telegraph, it has become much easier than it was before to hold a large territory. And since the coming of universal education, it has become easier to instill a more or less artificial loyalty throughout a large population. Modern technique has not only facilitated the psychology of cohesion in large groups, it has also made large groups imperative, both from an economic and from a military point of view. The advantages of mass production are a trite theme upon which I do not propose to enlarge. As everybody knows, they have been urged as a reason for closer unity among the nations of Western Europe. The Nile, from the earliest times, has promoted the cohesion of the whole of Egypt, since a government controlling only the upper Nile could destroy the fertility of lower Egypt. Here, no advanced technique was involved, but the Tennessee Valley Authority and the proposed St. Lawrence Waterway are scientific extensions of the same cohesive effect of rivers. Central power stations, distributing electricity over wide areas, have become increasingly important and are much more profitable when the area is large than when it is small. If it becomes practicable, as is not unlikely, to use atomic power on a large scale, this will enormously augment the profitable area of distribution. All of these modern developments increase the control over the lives of individuals possessed by those who govern large organizations, and at the same time make a few large organizations much more productive than a number of smaller ones. Short of the whole planet, there is no visible limit to the advantages of size, both in economic and in political organizations. I come now to another survey of roughly the same governmental developments from a different point of view. Governmental control over the lives of members of the community has differed throughout history, not only in the size of the governmental area, but in the intensity of its interference with individual life. What may be called civilization begins with empires of a well-defined type, of which Egypt, Babylon, and Nineveh are the most noticeable. Aztec and Inca empires were essentially of the same type. In such empires, the upper caste had at first a considerable measure of personal initiative, but the large slave population acquired in foreign conquest had none. The priesthood were able to interfere in daily life to a very great degree. Except where religion was involved, the king, having absolute power, could compel his subjects to fight in his wars. The divinity of the king and the reverence for the priesthood produced a stable society, in the case of Egypt, the most stable of which we have any knowledge. This stability was bought at the expense of rigidity, and these ancient empires became stereotyped to a point at which they could no longer resist foreign